Picture this. You're at a party. Someone walks up to you, smiles and says, "So, how about this weather we've been having?" And something inside you, something deep, almost primal, just deflates. Not because you're rude, not because you hate people, but because you are suddenly overwhelmingly aware that you are about to spend the next 4 minutes of your finite life on this earth talking about whether it might rain on Thursday. Sound familiar? If it does, you've probably been told at some point that you're too intense, too serious, maybe even antisocial. But here's the thing, and this is what most people get completely wrong. Hating small talk has almost nothing to do with hating people. In fact, some of the most deeply social, deeply connected human beings on the planet absolutely cannot stand it. And there's a genuinely fascinating psychological reason why. So let's get into it. First, let's define what we're actually talking about, because small talk is one of those phrases everyone uses but rarely thinks about critically. Small talk is essentially phatic communication, language that serves a social function rather than an informational one. When someone says, "I'm fine, how are you?" they're not requesting a medical update, they're performing a social ritual, a handshake in sentence form. And for a lot of people, that ritual feels not just hollow, but almost physically uncomfortable, like wearing a suit that doesn't fit. Now, why does that discomfort exist? This is where it gets interesting. Research in personality psychology, particularly work rooted in the Big Five personality model, consistently finds that people who report disliking small talk tend to score very high in a trait called openness to experience. What that means, practically speaking, is that their brains are wired to find abstract ideas, emotional depth, and intellectual novelty genuinely stimulating. Their reward circuits light up when conversations go somewhere unexpected. When someone says something that makes them rethink a belief, or share something real, or laugh at something unexpectedly dark and true. Small talk, by contrast, doesn't move the needle. It doesn't take the conversation anywhere new. And for a brain that's essentially hungry for depth, that stagnation doesn't just feel boring, it can actually feel draining. Think of it like this. Imagine you're someone who loves spicy food. Not mild, not medium, properly, aggressively spicy. And every single social event you attend serves you plain white rice. It's not offensive. It's not bad exactly. But your mouth is waiting for something that never arrives. That's the small talk experience for a lot of people. You show up hoping for something real, and you get weather updates. But here's where I want to push a little deeper, because there's more going on than just personality traits. There's actually a concept in psychology called need for cognition. The intrinsic motivation some people have to think deeply, to wrestle with complex ideas, to not let a surface-level answer be the final answer. People high in need for cognition aren't just intellectually curious. They actually experience thinking as rewarding in itself. And when you're wired that way, superficial exchanges don't just feel unfulfilling. They can feel like a kind of social performance you're being asked to give without any script that makes sense to you. There's also something worth saying about anxiety here, because small talk and social anxiety are weirdly intertwined in ways people don't always expect. You might assume that people who hate small talk are simply confident loners who prefer solitude. And sometimes that's true, but often, more often than you'd think, the person wincing at, "So, what do you do for work?" is actually someone who is deeply uncomfortable with surface-level uncertainty. When a conversation has no real substance, there are no real rules, no anchor. It's all improvisation, all the time. And for someone whose nervous system reads ambiguity as threat, that open-ended social floating can be genuinely stressful. Depth, paradoxically, can feel safer, because at least it's real. At least you know where you stand. There's a researcher named Arthur Aaron who developed something called the Fast Friends Protocol, a series of increasingly personal questions designed to create closeness between strangers rapidly. The most famous version of this became the 36 Questions to Fall in Love study. And what Aaron found was striking. People who engaged in escalating personal disclosure didn't just feel more connected, they felt significantly more comfortable with each other, even after just 45 minutes, compared to people who had conventional small talk conversations. In other words, depth doesn't just feel better to some people, it actually works better as a social bonding mechanism. The people who hate small talk aren't broken. They might just be skipping straight to what actually connects us. Now, I want to be fair here because small talk does serve a real function. It's a social lubricant, a way of signaling safety, of saying, I'm not a threat, you're not a threat. Let's establish that before we do anything else. In a lot of cultural contexts, skipping past that phase entirely can actually read as aggressive or presumptuous. Jumping straight into what's the most afraid you've ever been at a work function is not always going to land well. And the people who truly thrive socially usually have some fluency in both registers. They can do the small talk dance when the situation calls for it, while gravitating toward depth whenever the door opens. But if you're someone who struggles with that, if small talk genuinely feels like a performance you were never given rehearsal time for, there's real grace available to you in understanding why. Because the discomfort you feel isn't a character flaw, it's information. It's your brain telling you something about what you actually value in connection, and that's worth knowing. Here's the subtle irony that I keep coming back to. The people who hate small talk are often the ones most desperately hungry for genuine human connection. They don't want less social interaction. They want more real social interaction. They want the conversation that happens at 2 a.m. when the party's almost over and someone finally says something true. They want the moment where you find out that the person you thought you had nothing in common with has been quietly carrying the same strange, specific fear you've carried for years. They want that electric feeling of being actually known by another person, rather than just recognized. And that longing, when you see it clearly, is one of the most fundamentally human things there is. So if this is you, if you've always found yourself counting down the seconds through polite conversation until you can finally ask someone what they actually believe, what they're actually afraid of, what actually keeps them up at night, maybe let that be something you're a little proud of, not in a superior way, not in an I'm too deep for basic conversation way, because trust me, nobody wants to be at that dinner party, but in a quiet, honest way. You are someone who takes connections seriously. You're someone who doesn't want to waste the limited time you have with another person on nothing. That's not a social liability, that's a value system. And maybe the move isn't to force yourself to love small talk, but to get better at gently, warmly steering conversations toward the places where you actually come alive, and where, more often than you'd expect, other people do too. Because a lot of people are doing the small talk dance not because they love it, but because they think everyone else does. They're waiting for someone to open a different door. Maybe you can be that person. If any of this landed for you, if you heard yourself somewhere in here, I'd genuinely love to know what you think in the comments. What's the conversation you're always hoping someone will start? And if you want to keep exploring ideas like this one, the hidden mechanics of how we think, feel, and connect, stick around. There's a lot more where this came from.